Lucas Grindley knows a thing about building sustainable revenue streams for media companies. When he was hired to Hear Media, a network of LGBT news outlets, it was losing money, but over a period of 6 years, he nurtured it back to profitability. Now he's the executive director of Next City, a 20-year-old nonprofit magazine dedicated to urban policy in equitable cities. When he first joined, the publication was almost entirely reliant on large grants, but he's since diversified its revenue by building up its ad sales and small donor memberships. Recently, it crossed the threshold of 1,000 paying members. In a recent interview, Lucas walked me through his successful tenure at Hear Media and explained how he's brought a similar playbook to Next City. Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and this is The Business of Content, the show about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. If you want to listen to an audio version of this show, subscribe to The Business of Content wherever you get your podcasts. And longtime listeners of this show know that it carries no advertising. The only way to support the painstaking work I do here is by becoming a paid subscriber to my newsletter. Subscribers get a half-hour introductory phone call with me. They also get to submit questions every month that I try my best to answer on this very show. Subscribe at simonowens.substack.com. That's simonowens.substack.com. Or just Google the words Simon Owens and newsletter. Okay, on to my interview with Lucas. Hey Lucas, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So you're the executive director of this nonprofit news outlet called Next City, which is kind of, we'll talk about what it does, but it's broadly dedicated to making cities better at all sorts of things. But before we jump into that, I'd love to just hear a little bit about your journalism background before joining that, because you have, experience both as a journalist, but then also you've worked at kind of like more senior levels of media companies in terms of helping them from a business perspective, right?
I'm a journalist turned media executive by requirement, right? We need more people who understand both journalism and the revenue side of things. And I was like, well, here I am. I can do that. So before I came to Next City, I was working in for-profit media. Next City is nonprofit. And I was president of our company called Pride Media, which is the largest LGBT news company in the country. And I was also editor-in-chief of The Advocate, which is the longest-running LGBT news magazine in the country. And we were owned by a Hollywood media executive, actually, who thought that, media was going to be his retirement. It would be easier than making all these movies, right? And that's not how it went. So he was struggling to make the company profitable, and we had been successful on the editorial side. He was on my couch in the office talking to me all the time and said, you know what, maybe you can do it. So he made me managing director of the publishing division, and that's where we started. We weren't profitable to start with at Pride Media, and by the time I was done, at least, we had turned it around. We had a 20% profit margin, $3 million in profit, and eventually sold the company, but that's another story.
Yeah, so The Advocate, that predates the internet, right? Like, it's a long-running magazine. And when did this person buy the entire Pride Media ecosystem?
The Hollywood executive producer guy sold it to this hedge fund, and it must have been
when did he buy it?
When did the Hollywood executive producer buy it? He predated my arrival, and he actually bought a bunch of things all at one time. He ran this broadcast LGBT company called Hear Media and consolidated a thing that was a dating service called Gay.com all into this behemoth of The Advocate and Out Magazine, and actually a really popular magazine called HIV Plus, which is for communities who are struggling with HIV. So he had done it a long time before. I'm not exactly sure how many years.
Yeah, and when did you join the company? Approximately what year?
I was coming from National Journal magazine in DC, where I was the managing editor, and had just finished Obama's first term. I think it was 2011 when I first got to The Advocate.
Mm-hmm. And so once you were kind of elevated to this senior level position, obviously this was a time of great turmoil within media. There was the Great Recession, journalism jobs were hemorrhaging. There was this shift from print to digital, but the digital wasn't providing enough revenue to make up for what was lost from the print side. What were some of the changes you kind of pushed through to get you towards profitability?
You're absolutely right that The Advocate and Out Magazine were historically well-known cash cows on the print side, right? And the Advocate had been shrinking pages, and the normal shift from print to digital was part of what they were struggling with. And you really just had to stabilize that on the subscriber side, especially because there's a certain amount of cost that goes into acquiring subscribers. We'll set all that aside, right? The main thing that we did to start was gather everybody together and ask what they needed. And I met with every single person who worked for me on marketing and advertising to see what it was that they needed, right? Even though I had been there for years, to know more intimately what the problems were that they were encountering. So I did that same thing with the head of advertising, right? Who we were colleagues and now he was working for me, right? Which was a strange dynamic. But you had to establish some level of trust amongst all of those people that you were really listening to them and would act on the things that they said were possible. And we had two choices. One was cut our way to profitability, and the other was grow our way to profitability. And I felt like we could grow our way to profitability, and so did all of those people. So things we changed. It was that moment when every advertising campaign that would come in, every RFP would ask for branded content, right? So we created a branded content studio within the company that was loosely organized before, but now had new leadership. I moved one of our top editors into the branded content studio, and he ran that more smoothly. And it was this time when video was emerging, right? And we had these very high CPMs for video, but we didn't have on the content side the video to support all of those demand for impressions. So we created a video team that could drive up the number of impressions. That required investment, both of those things, right? And so we maybe made a few cuts here and there, but mostly we tried to grow our revenue. And probably one of the most important changes we made to grow our revenue was the compensation for the salespeople. And I think that goes overlooked a lot of times, but we were operating on a standard, 3% commission rate, and we implemented a more of an incentive structure that was 369 depending on different goals and some other things. And I think that made a tremendous difference to whether or not people felt ownership over these goals that we had. And yeah, we ended with, 15 million in revenue. We ended with our record Pride Month in 2017 and then another record Pride Month in 2018. LGBT media is seasonal, and that's our biggest opportunity.
That's interesting. You don't think of that as like a seasonal business, but I guess that makes sense. You see a lot
Very
of, especially
seasonal.
now, there's a lot of ad campaigns and marketing campaigns and stuff, around Pride Month. You mentioned kind of branded content. Obviously, this was during the kind of rise in branded content where everybody was trying to BuzzFeed and Vice were kind of leading the way. Obviously there are challenges in terms of scalability of branded content, and that's like the roadblock that like the BuzzFeeds of the world ran into is like you can only, because it's such bespoke content and obviously more expensive than just like standard display advertising, it takes like a greater ad budget. But because you were niche, and maybe because you weren't trying to be BuzzFeed where you were trying to have a valuation of $2 billion or whatever, this kind of worked perfect. It was kind of your sweet spot as kind of like a niche kind of small media company, I'm guessing.
Well, I don't think you get to decide for advertisers what they want. If they come to it and they want branded content or they want video, your responsibility in the RFP is to answer that need in some way. That doesn't mean that you have to fill your proposal to them with only branded content, but you definitely have to check the box, otherwise they're going to someone else. So we weren't organized in a way that allowed us to even check the box consistently, and then deliver on all those almost impossible demands for revisions and going back and forth. So we had to get better at that. We picked the best person from the editorial team that I could find to run that, and I think it ran much more smoothly, and we were able to have the sales team confidently sell it, which is also a detractor. It makes them hesitate. Do I really want to sell this if I'm not sure it's going to make my client happy? And they had to have that confidence that they could.
Yeah. So you get it to profitability. The Hollywood executive guy you said sells it to a hedge fund or a private equity company. How did you decide to leave the company?
It was not an easy decision because this was a dream job for me. I had been writing letters to the Advocate since college, being like, hey, I'd take any job that you have there. I'd love to work there. And someone finally answered my letters after I worked in DC National Journal, right? So it was a dream job. It's hard to leave, but it was clear that we didn't share the same values. at some point, I remember I had a conversation with the new owner, and he said, "You should stay on because you're going to make so much money here with us." And I was like, I don't think, my internal dialogue was, I don't think you understand journalism. No one has ever said to a journalist, you should stay, you're going to make a lot of money, right? That's not why I'm in journalism. And so our values didn't align. Also, it was the first time in the history of the company or any of these brands that they were owned by straight people. They weren't owned by LGBTQ people anymore. That felt off, and especially off as I got to know them more. And we had interactions that just led me to believe that this was not the right place for me. I tried for a while to stay and make it work for the people, but eventually after I left, they cut over half the staff. We used to be 60 people across 2 offices. They closed the offices. Like all the normal things that you see happen, they started to do.
They were trying to give you equity so that you would benefit from some kind of exit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had stock options of some kind available to me that I would have vested 1 month later before I left. And I was like, this is not important to me that I be vested in this version of the company.
So you eventually, after you left, you came on as executive director of something called Next City. Can you give us just like a brief overview of the history of what Next City is and how it was originally founded and what it was originally, designed to be?
Happy birthday to us. It's our 20-year anniversary this year. So we're the granddaddy of nonprofit newsrooms, I think, or one of them. Next City was founded by college students. I mean, fancy college students. They're from Yale, but they were college students, and they just got together all of their friends and said, hey, we think that cities are being talked about only in terms of their problems, and we want to change the narrative, right? So they were doing narrative change by just getting all their friends to do graphic design and photos and write articles for what became this print magazine that was called Next American City. And it was distributed all over the country. People could buy subscriptions. It got written up in the New York Times when it debuted, and they called it a subtle plan to change the world, which I think that we are. But we were doing solutions journalism before solutions journalism even had a name.
And it's about making cities better, but how does it differ from like a city lab, which is owned by Bloomberg, which is focused on policy and stuff like that, of, urban development and all that kind of stuff, like how to make, you think of the classic city lab, it's like, how do you make cities greener? How do you make it so they're more pedestrian friendly? How do you, all these things that, when you're dealing with this invention of humans, the city, like how do you design it so that it works better for the millions of people that live in it? How does what you do differ from that at all?
And City Lab wasn't always owned by Bloomberg. That's a somewhat recent change.
Before, mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think ownership matters. I want to say that first, which is that having a nonprofit ownership model means you can be more focused on mission. I think the history of newspapers and magazines is that we've been owned by or created by these rich millionaires, billionaires, and I think that does influence what our coverage looks like, and at least a little, right? So I think there's some difference, maybe not specifically with City Lab, but definitely overall in the market when you're talking about all these hedge funds or billionaires owning media. They're doing it for a different reason than these nonprofit boards who run them, right? Or their executive directors. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is maybe Next City started in a lot like City Lab, right? Like maybe City Lab was somewhat inspired by Next City and what that group of people were doing, in that there was a view that cities could just get better by becoming more prosperous or more efficient at getting people from one place to the next. And really what I discovered even coming to Next City, idealistically, I thought that everybody would want cities to be more equitable, right? I was coming from social justice journalism, right? And that's not the case. Actually, a lot of people in city planning and architecture and economic development are still only working on cities being more prosperous, when really the root is whether or not they're more racially equitable. You can't solve poverty only by trying to make people more prosperous and hope that it trickles down, right? That's not how it works. You have to focus on where the need is greatest. And that's what Next City does and all of our readers do. Our readers are people who are working in this space, but they're not just every city planner, right? It's only the people who believe that racial equity is the goal of their work. So when we ask people, 74% of people say they use us for their job, and 90% of people say their job includes advancing racial equity. So that's different from, I think, any other publication in the country.
Yeah. And I'm not going to pretend that I've read The Power Broker, but based on my understanding, Robert Moses, which is probably one of the world's most famous city planners, he was famous for kind of reinventing New York in a way that was considered racist by many, right? So that would be kind of like the antithesis of of what your publication does in terms of trying to be to make it so that all people are kind of benefit from the policies that you're advocating for.
Yeah, we'd be much more on the side of Jane Jacobs than Robert Moses in that fight for sure. But we would also now say it's extremely important that if you want to have progress, you have to address the damage caused by Robert Moses or other policies created by city planning, like redlining, where they say, we're going to have people of color in this neighborhood and white people in this neighborhood, and that those decisions are playing out today. We live with the momentum of history today, and you can't just go in and say, oh, we're going to build a stadium or whatever it might be, and ignore the long-standing distrust created by those decisions in the communities that they serve. So a lot of what we do is talking about how do you create truth and reconciliation processes that work, or community engagement processes that are actually democratic. And we ask people what they're doing and try to talk about a solutions in the hopes that someone who reads this or hears one of our webinars or our podcast episodes then decides that that's the inspiration for their work, or they share it with someone and it spreads that way.
And you see like a lot of like urban wonks, I don't know, urban planning wonks, I don't know what the terminology is. They're advocating against things like they want cities to like have fewer cars and stuff like that. Would that be like an issue that your publication would take some kind of stance on?
I don't think of it as stances as much. In this world of, two-sidism and objectivity debates in journalism, I really think it's about what audience do you serve? What does that group of people already believe? And if you're in service to them, you're helping them to make decisions about what things they support, right? But you're not questioning the basis for their values, right? So we're not going to put up a discussion about whether or not it was okay to run a highway through a black neighborhood. That's a given. No, that was wrong. But if we're going to talk about whether or not streets should be car free, especially during the pandemic, we are going to discuss, well, what's the impact on people who are depending on the bus to get from point A or point B, and then you're closing roads or making their travel longer, right? And balancing that with, well, you might have play streets where you can invite children out and use them more, or you might be able to support restaurants to recover during the pandemic. So we'll have an actual discussion, I think, about that. But at the same time, most of our stories definitely favor car-free streets. We've done roundups of all the different places that have gone this way since the pandemic and like have continued those policies because there are great advantages to being outside and being able to get a more walkable city.
Mm-hmm. And
there's these 15-minute city debates in the right wing about like the 15-minute city is coming to get you for some reason, and we're just like, that just means that you can walk from one place to the next.
It's a weird scare tactic.
Mm-hmm.
You said it started as a print publication. Has it mainly morphed to like almost 100% online? Is there still a print component?
It was 100% online, and then when I started at Next City, it was our 15-year anniversary, and I had just come from The Advocate where we had done our 50th anniversary, and that was a huge opportunity to rally our supporters. We made a bunch of money off of doing that, right? And so for our 15th anniversary, we published our first annual magazine, and we've been doing it since then. It's called Solutions of the Year. And we look back over our coverage for the year and we say, this, and this were the ones that you absolutely should not miss. And then we do a Solutions of the Year festival, which is a webinar festival that goes along with it because our readers are national. We can't do it in person, right? So we restarted the print publication once a year as a way to galvanize our supporters.
And now I suddenly remember what my next question was you kind of hinted at this before, but like in terms of the readership of the publication, it's mainly people who work in city government or city planning, or the vendors that service cities. That's kind of like your core readership, right?
For sure. Yeah. We know that we we know that we have way more people working in nonprofits than your everyday. So nonprofits are like 10% of the US workforce, but 44% of our readers, right, say that they work in nonprofits. That says a little bit about who reads us. They're people who care about the most vulnerable in their cities, and that's why we run our coverage the way we do, where our coverage is different from other media in the subjects we choose, in the staff who writes those stories, and in the sources who are quoted in the stories. So, I mean, on staffing, for example, 65% of the stories written in 22 were authored by a journalist of color. And that is just not the way that you see in other media, right? And at a time when the News Leaders Association can't even get these newsrooms to return their survey on what their staffs look like in terms of diversity, we've grown from a staff that was, roughly 16%, which means we had one person who was a person of color, to now over 70% of our staff are people of color. So it's the same thing going from our writers and to our full-time staff, and our board is growing in diversity. So it's a major priority for us. And then in sourcing, we're trying to build this thing called SourceLight that makes it regimented, what we kind of do routinely. Our senior economic justice correspondent, Oscar Perriabello, has, ever since he started working with us, kept a spreadsheet of who he quotes in his pieces, who are his published sources. And he knows that last year, 95% of his stories included at least one person of color or woman who was quoted. And we're hoping to achieve that across all of our writers, to know that and promise it to our readership.
Yeah, I think I read that NPR is doing something like that in terms of who they have on air, like actually tracking that on a source by source basis. So okay, we have a good background on what the publication is and its history. So you came to work on it. What was kind of your entry? Like, what did you seek them out? Did they seek you out? And like, what was the kind of what were they bringing you on to do? What was your kind of mandate coming on to work there?
I sought them out because I was just in this moment where the private equity firm had bought us, and I was looking around saying, where can I go where this won't happen again? We had that $3 million in profit, and then that $3 million goes to rich people, right? That wasn't kept and reused and invested in the staff because the company was sold. So the profits get divvied up at that point, right? I didn't want that to happen again, and I was looking around for a nonprofit newsroom. I didn't know even that much about nonprofit newsrooms at this point, but I found Next City via a regular job ad, applied, and they were in a tough spot. They had just transitioned from a different executive director. Honestly, the finances weren't in good shape. They maybe had 3 months of run room, and they were very upfront about that. And for whatever reason, I was coming from LGBT media and wasn't concerned by that. I was like, oh, well, we were losing money before. It can't be that hard, can it? Right? Which was probably a naive thing to think. Anyway, so I did get there. It was things like I bought my own laptop. I paid for my ticket to go to the interview because I wanted to see people in person. It was that sort of thing. In nonprofit media, they don't have money to relocate you. It was like, I'm going to get there. So I really wanted to go to Next City. Leaving for-profit media as the, president of the company, you can imagine I took a pay cut in order to go work in nonprofit media. I talked with my husband about that, and we made it work, and they're still making it work. It's been very rewarding work to do. But the mandate was, hey, how do we become more sustainable? And somehow we raise this money every year, and I've been here for 5 years doing that because we have an amazing staff and we've made a bunch of changes that I think work.
Hey, I just want to interrupt the programming for just a moment to note that you are at the halfway point of the video. If you made it this far, then that's probably a sign that you like this sort of content. So maybe just take a second to subscribe to the channel below. If you're feeling especially generous, you can hit the like button. Okay, back to the show. And okay, let's start getting into those changes. So when you joined, what was kind of the revenue mix? Based on my understanding, it was very reliant on kind of larger grants and donors and stuff like that, right?
Sure. And like most nonprofits, we're still very reliant on grants, though I guess less so. We had come off of several multi-year grants that were big, right? So this was the thing that had sustained them, or these multi-year grants that had been secured a while ago and that then were running out. So that was part of the, race to do something, right? Was, can we get some of these renewed? What can we do? We didn't have really any what I would call revenue producing positions, right? I was looking around, I was like, who is in charge of selling the ads or anything like that? And it was just when someone wrote to us, there was a person who would reply and say, here, I'll put up your ad. So
it was all inbound. There was no sales.
Not really, no. So that was one thing we changed immediately, is we converted a position to a part-time salesperson who did an amazing job growing up that whole space, right? Like, she had not even been in sales before, so I had to work with her on how to do that, and she did an amazing job. So we grew it from, it was like $40,000 annually in advertising to what is now our goal for this year is $190,000 in advertising, and we're already at, I just had to check in yesterday, we're 140 something so far this year. So we're on our way to the goal for the year.
I mean, yeah, like, given that your readership are the decision makers within cities, that's got to be like, in terms of all the various contractors and companies that service cities, that's got to be an industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars, right? I'm almost surprised that you don't have companies beating down your door wanting to advertise with you.
I would love that. Yes, can you make that happen? That would be great.
as soon as you appear on this podcast, just wait for your inbox.
They're all gonna, the phones are gonna light up. Yeah. I think there actually is a lot more possible in advertising, and that's why the part-time position then converted to a full-time position. This will be the first full year where it's full-time, because the board has recognized that this is a growing space and that we think we can do even more. I'm excited about that. Yeah.
And I think one of the other things that you set out to do is kind of diversify your donor base so that you had more smaller kind of membership and donor driven, so you weren't completely reliant on these big donors and grants and stuff like that. So let's get into that. So I think like the first thing that was kind of the catalyst is you got accepted into the Facebook Accelerator program. Am I getting the timeline right? So what is the Facebook Accelerator?
It was still called the Facebook Accelerator program, and it was renamed while we were there to the Meta Accelerator program. And it was run by Blue Engine, which is just an incredible group of people. And 3 of our staff were part of this cohort of news organizations, and many news organizations had already gone through this accelerator, right? I want to say we were the last cohort before it all closed down, right? Because Facebook stopped funding journalism in the same way that it had been doing before. So when we joined the accelerator, we knew we wanted more what we call sustaining members, people who give monthly or yearly and they check a box to make it recurring. And we were losing sustaining members. We had 660 sustaining members at the start of 2021. We joined the accelerator in November, and we were already down to 550 sustainers, right? So we were losing people. And then the first thing they do is, you're going through all these classes, and then they actually have a person go through your site who's a professional and gives you like specific notes about things you could change. And we implement as many of those as we possibly can. And by May of the following year, we had 600 sustainers again. So we had like reversed the bleeding, right? Just by doing some small things.
Like what?
Well, they said you need to have a focus on recurring donors in your ask, right? We would default normally to a one-time donation of $60, I think. And they were like, well, if you do this study of the long-term value of a donor, a recurring donor for us worked out to be worth more for their customer lifetime value than a one-time donor, because one-time donor renewal drops off so much, right? And you know this from every other part of news, is that if you have someone on a recurring, subscription, the retention rate can go way up, especially if you focus on retention. That was a big part of what made National Journal work, is that people would renew these institutional subscriptions just easily. Same thing in print magazines for Out or The Advocate, is you really wanted people on a recurring subscription. Same thing for subscriptions to gay.com, which I used to help with. So it's made sense that would be the case. And so we shifted our asks to focus on sustaining members through our end of year event, which was, November, December news match. And that was a big part of it, is just that shift, but also simplify the donation page process. We were asking people for their address because we wanted to send them a donation gift, or we wanted to send them a copy of the magazine. We were like, well, what we're going to do instead, we're just going to get rid of the information so it doesn't slow down the process, and we'll ask them later if they want to get the magazine, something like that. And, just simple things like, the colors of the buttons and things, you're not highlighting the transaction button, so maybe you lose people in that process, or you're not showing pictures of credit cards to show that this is the actual, give you some legitimacy, right? So all those kinds of changes just led to this stop the bleeding around sustaining memberships. And then we had this big moment, which we were working toward, and the Facebook Accelerator program gives you a little grant to actually do this work. And we shifted our entire site to a new registration wall model that we call Pay What You Wish, and that had been based on the success of something we were trying with webinars a few years earlier.
So you said a registration wall. Is it like a very strict registration wall where they cannot read unless they do it? Or is it like the Guardian's registration wall that you can kind of click out of very easily?
We're not too worried about people who, if they want to read the stories and just get around the wall, more power to you, right? We're just trying to find people who actually want to donate to support us. So the way it works is it's like a meter. It's, counting the number of stories. Here's your first story. Here's your second story. Here's your third story. And then, now it's time to pay what you wish to join, including nothing at all. So we say you can join for nothing at all by giving us an email address and signing up for our newsletter, or here's the average donation that our other readers make, which is $10 a month, or make a one-time donation. But sustaining donors are the ones who become members of the site. And so since we made this wall across all the site, where it's on stories, it's on webinars, it's on everything we offer, we have now grown to 991 sustaining members as of today.
So hopefully by the time this goes out, it'll be 1,000.
I hope so.
So we can have a nice headline for this podcast, how it reached 1,000 paying members. Yes. And so it's a registration wall, and it's sort of metered, but it's not a paywall. Nothing is, but it's like the registration wall is your chance to nudge them. Is that kind of the psychology behind why it's there? Or is it to get them on an email list, which will make them more likely to convert further down the line? Or what's the kind of thinking there?
Both those things, because people don't realize how much they rely on you, right? So you have to remind them that they've read 3 articles, even that much, right? In my ideal world, we would be able to count the whole month or the whole year. You've read this many articles.
Yeah,
would you like to
Guardian
donate?
Does. Yeah.
Yeah. We don't quite have the technology for that right now, but I think that's important, is to let people know how much that they're using you. And then, get them on the email list, because the email list is the thing that is most likely to convert to donations, according to what the work we've done during the Accelerator to figure out where donations are coming from. But we felt like it's very important, as an organization that is trying to help people in low-income, marginalized, disadvantaged communities, that we don't put up a hard wall that says you must pay in order to access our content, because we're trying to spread information about how to make cities more racially equitable. You can't do that and then put up this subscription wall.
What about like distribution? Have you made any changes in terms of like where you're getting your traffic from, where you become more reliant on certain, distribution levers and less reliant on others? Obviously, maybe when you were coming in, social media was a larger factor. Now, obviously, with the registration wall, you're getting more people on your email list. How has that dynamic changed, your approach?
Yeah, you're right. Social media was a whole different thing when I started, and now it's like trying to find new footing there. But on the email side, we've definitely focused on trying to increase the email list. And we made a few missteps, I would say, along the way, where we were losing email subscribers before we joined the Accelerator and rolled out this new strategy. And now we've increased the number of email subscribers, in part because of the Pay What You Wish wall, but also because then we launched new email products that were trying to get people enticed, right? We've also found that because email is most likely to convert a person into a donor, that it was important to make more of a human connection over email. So one of the first things that we did, this was, I think, when Substack was just beginning, right? We converted, for example, our newsletter on economic justice into a self-contained, here's the story, you don't have to click through and go anywhere, and hey, this email is from Oscar at Next City, even though it's coming from MailChimp, right? And it has Oscar's picture at the top and a little intro from Oscar. I mean, all these things that we talk about all the time that actually I think made a huge difference in maybe not directly in the number of donations from an email, but certainly in the connection that people felt to Oscar. And that's incredibly important to referrals for other types of things, grant funding, whatever it might be. And I mean, Oscar will tell you now that part of the reason he's on book leave right now is because he developed this close relationship with these thousands of readers who see him as a thought leader in economic justice.
And you mentioned webinars before. Like, what kind of other stuff other than the written content that you're producing? What are the different kind of other types of media that you've started creating?
When I started, we were not doing webinars, but the staff, I did a similar thing with the staff at Next City as I did at Pride Media, where I was like, what do you need? What do you think that we should be doing? And this came up was, well, we've always wanted to do webinars. And that's when we invented the pay what you wish model, because one of the staff said, well, we can't charge for it. We could ask for donations. Let's build this pay what you wish to join the webinar. And we created actually a little progress bar. Like, here's our goal for this webinar. We want to raise $1,000. And then it tracks as people register how many donate in response, and the bar goes up, that sort of thing. So every single webinar becomes a fundraising event, right? So we started doing these webinars. We've had over 8,000 people joined a webinar last year. I don't know what it is so far, but we keep doing them. And actually, webinars also then turned into an advertising opportunity because we get all these people who want to do sponsored webinars, like branded content webinars, right? So we've made a significant amount of advertising revenue off of it as well. The other thing that we do are ebooks, which had sort of subsided when I started, and then we brought them back, and they work the same way now, where each one is sort of a fundraiser. We say, download this ebook. It's pay what you wish to download. Or if you're a sustaining member, you can just click and download it. You don't ever get asked for money again. And we have the progress bar that says, oh, we want to raise this much money and this many people downloaded it. The ebooks, for people who don't know, are more like, they're like white papers, or they're like assemblies of our best reporting, just in an easily shareable way. And a lot of people, they don't get the email on Tuesday that had that one story that was great. And so you reassemble it into an ebook, and then it's easier for them to share.
It's interesting. I actually just started taking my case studies and packaging them as ebooks on Gumroad that I'm going to sell individually, and I'm planning to announce that today in today's newsletter. Although by the time anyone sees this, it'll be several months from now, or weeks, or whatever. And
well, if they missed it, then this is their moment.
Yeah, I'll know if it's successful by then. But like, what's an example of like a really successful ebook for you?
The most successful ebook would be one where it was also underwritten, right? Because these are new products that aren't entirely reliant on individual contributions. That's part of the mix. But ideally, you get an underwriter who's interested in the work. So we had a partnership with LISC, where after the pandemic, we were trying to figure out what are ways that small businesses that are led by people of color can recover more quickly. And long story is, we did some stories that helped set up some conversation that they had, and then worked to edit a playbook that they put together for strategies for equitable recovery. And then we jointly distributed that as a Next City ebook, and did a webinar to promote the ebook's release, and then some more stories that were inspired by what was in the playbook. And that was easily our most successful, because we got money obviously to do all of that work, and then also fundraised off the webinar and fundraised off the ebook release.
So there's been a lot of interesting stuff happening in cities over the last few years. Obviously, there was the pandemic, which caused a rise in remote work, and a lot of debates over, real estate and office spaces. There was, a temporary spike in crime. There was the George Floyd protests, which, obviously a lot of conversation around police forces and how you allocate money that way. And then obviously there's this green energy transition that's happening that's really accelerated in the last 2 or 3 years, and a lot of that is centered around cities as well. What has that done for Next City? Like, is that, have you seen an explosion? Is it more kind of like a slow linear graph, or did that change the dynamic somehow in how much people were paying attention to you or anything like that?
I also host the Next City podcast, and I can't tell you how many times when I'm talking to a a practitioner who's created some new solution. Like a guy who literally launched the first black bank in 20 years said that George Floyd's murder was the moment that was pivotal for the creation of that new thing, right? And, I've heard that for I created a bank, or I heard that for I created a crowdsourcing tool that helps people in their neighborhood own the shopping center, right? So community-owned real estate. It comes up all the time that this was a turning point in people's work. And just as often as they say that it was a turning point for them personally, they say there was an influx of money promised by all these large organizations, and some of that momentum has seemed to disappear. And there's a reevaluation, I don't know what you would call it, of the prioritization that people seem to have after Black Lives Matter movement swept the country in that moment you're talking about. And we did not see directly, I think, revenue come in that was new because of this change, right? I think there were a lot more organizations working in direct service that did see that money, and they're now seeing it sort of be more wishy-washy. But they haven't changed, and they've used it to get to where they are now, and now they're looking around for supporters who really do believe in long-term change and are actually just putting out the word that, some of these commitments weren't long-term. They're not sticking to them. And I think it's important to talk about that.
So when you look ahead, the next 2 to 3 years, now you're a little bit more diversified, you have more advertising revenue, you have more small donor membership revenue. What is your kind of ambition? What would you like to be doing 2 years from now that you're not doing now?
One thing we're about to do, thanks to the Mellon Foundation, is we, during our strategic planning from a couple of years ago, identified that all of our individual contributions come from small dollar donors, almost 100%, right? And if you look at like the INN index, they ask people, what is the mix of your individual contributions? And they would say 60% of our individual contributions are from major donors, right? I think it's $5,000 or more, something like that. We don't have any major donors, never have in 20 years, but we've also never had a major gifts officer. So the Mellon Foundation is supporting our capacity to hire a major gifts officer and some other things on that side. And if we're making $120,000 right now from individual contributions, which is our budgeted goal for the year, then if we add basically this major gifts officer, the goal is that then, let's say that number doesn't change, but 60% of that bucket is from major gifts. That means we'd get to $300,000 that are from individuals, from people, right? And it would pay for itself at one day to have this major gifts officer. But it's like chicken and the egg for so many people, including us, to say, well, who's going to support us having a major gifts officer? Or who's going to support us hiring a full-time advertising person? We had to build that little by little by little so that then the board could say, okay, let's do this, right? But there definitely needs to be in philanthropy more organizations who are saying, yes, I will support you in this thing that is proven to increase revenue and actually then sustain itself over time. It's just that also I think not enough of us have the vocabulary in order to show that that will be the case in a way that they'll go, okay, yeah, I'll do that, even because so many people don't already do that. You have to make a persuasive case that it's possible. So I'm excited about that because I think that will be a big change for us.
Yeah, so you have the large grants, you have the small individual donors, but there's this other category within nonprofits that are basically rich people with expendable income that are looking to make, they can make these, $1,000, $5,000, and maybe they'll also use it as like a tax write-off. So there's a little bit of a tax strategy there as well, but that's like a group that needs to be cultivated by a specific person versus small donors, which are like can mainly be driven in through standard marketing practices, whereas like the large donors need a more personal touch.
They absolutely need a more personal touch. You can go to any training on how you do major donors, which I've been to, and they outline the steps and you're like, oh, wow, I cannot just fit that into my day job, right? And in nonprofit news, at least, I know so many people who are expected to fit that into their day job, right? That they're the executive director who's running the day-to-day operations, trying to make grant applications. Maybe they're doing advertising. A lot of people aren't. And then they're also expected to cultivate major donors. The reason it's at 60% now is because the story of the founding of so many nonprofit newsrooms is that they had an ally who really believed in what they were doing, right? So if you didn't have that ally and you just decided you were going to bootstrap it as a journalist, maybe who was leaving an organization that was bought by a hedge fund or whatever it might be, you probably don't have that 60%. And you're playing that same game of whether or not you can find an organization, a foundation who will help you invest in this.
Okay, Lucas, well, those are all the questions I have for you. Where can people find you online?
nextcity.org, or download the podcast anywhere on Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcasts.
Awesome. Well, it was a lot of fun. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Simon.